Hi, my name is Hal Palmer. So far this semester, we've learned a lot about the characteristics of organizations, whether we're talking about the classical style of organization, or if we're talking about the humanistic style, or any that employ a combination of the different theories. They have one thing in common, that every organization has a culture. And it is likely there are many subcultures too, especially when there is diversity amongst its members, and there likely is. Even if you had an organization with 2 people, there's a level of diversity, but when you add more people and that have differences in personalities, age, gender, race, religion, politics, etc., the diversity becomes great. Now, there are many ingredients to what makes an organization great, but one of the most important ingredients is culture. I have to ask, what kind of culture is best? With the diversity mentioned, is there a single culture that we want to try to achieve? I believe that there are many cultural alternatives that we can have, but yet we can still achieve a great organization with any number of variations. It is probably obvious to you by now that I wanted to talk about organizational culture in this presentation. In our textbook, it says, culture affects the workplace because it affects what we do and how we behave. Cultural variations influence our values, which in turn affect attitudes and ultimately behaviors. And they have a great chart to go with that in our textbook. I mean, it's true. Culture does affect our values, and values affect our attitudes, and attitudes in turn causes us to behave in certain ways, which affects our culture. And it continues in this cycle over and over, and I think it would be safe to say that culture is never static. Ideally, this circle would be, in a perfect organization, would be a perfectly round circle. But realistically, it's probably not perfectly round because the values change. They fluctuate up and down, and attitudes change, for good or bad attitudes, which affects our behavior, which, affects if we make the right choice or wrong choice, and which affects our culture. It's just a never-ending cycle. So really, what is organizational culture, and how would you define it? Culture is how a group behaves, whatever that group is. Our textbook defines it as the unique characteristics of a people, something that is shared by all or most members of a society, something that older members of society attempt to pass along to younger members, and something that shapes our view of the world. Well, we can apply this definition into an organization. So organizational culture is basically an organization or group of people that have values and attitudes and behaviors that are generally shared by its members, that are passed from older members, example, leaders, to newer members, and that shape views and ultimate actions of that organization. As you observe around you in the organizations that you're part of, can you identify the culture? Is it a good culture? Does the culture need to change? We recently had a discussion board in our class in week 7 of our course, where we were supposed to pick an organization and analyze it and its culture. Kristen Donnelly was in my discussion group, and she profiled an organization that could use some improvement. There were only 3 people in this organization, and frustration developed mainly between the supervisor and her subordinates. I got the sense that the supervisor didn't value and support those who she supervised. In contrast, I worked at a company for 26 years, and for the most part, I considered the culture of that organization as being a great culture. people were happy. Most employees had worked there for over 15 years. It was like a family to me. What was the difference? I think people had something to do with that. I listened to a TED Talk by a man named Jay Wilkinson titled Company Culture. He said, people, more than business plans or physical assets, are really what makes a strong company. And I've learned that leveraging by deliberate design a company culture, a company has an opportunity that goes far beyond what they can imagine. In other words, employing people in a company with a great culture has the best chance to succeed and achieve success beyond expectation. I, for one, would like to see organizations improve and succeed. I want to be part of that success. So I'd like to be part of cultural change. The question is, can we change the culture of an organization? I watched a number of TED Talks and presentations given by experts in the field and learned a lot of good ideas. But a common theme that was that it is tough to change the culture, and many times you will fail. In our course study, we had an article called How to Change Your Organization Culture. And it says, culture is one of those changing an entrenched culture is the toughest task you will face. To do so, you must win the hearts and minds of the people you work with. And that takes both cunning and persuasion. Yes, I agree with that statement wholeheartedly. I watched a presentation titled 5 Ways to Change Your Organizational Culture by Kim Harbutt. And he had some good ideas, and he had a great analogy. He said, culture is one of those strange things that is not directly changeable. It is like a shadow on the wall. You have to change the light source or change the object blocking the light. When you change those, the shadow changes. So yeah, you cannot change culture directly. You have to change the other things around it that affect that shadow, however it moves. He went on to say, as a leader, you cannot change all that influences the culture. All you can do is manage the input. And that is so true. Leaders can't change everything that affects culture, but what they can do is put some things in place to help them in that task. And this Mr. Harbaugh had some suggestions. He had 5 points that I would like to summarize here. The first one is structures in the organization. You can structure an organization many ways, and it depends on the organization to how you do it. But if you can do it so you can bring people together and develop a high level of cooperation and collaboration, then that will encourage innovation and improve the culture. The second item is policy. What is policy? It's rules. If you set the right policies, then people will be able to tell what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. The third part is incentives. What we incentivize is usually what we get. And this can be tricky. If you've ever managed an organization trying to incentive people with pay, other rewards, other things, it can be difficult. But if you do it properly, it can really improve the culture. The fourth item was metrics. You should be able to measure what you value. And that's a way to monitor your progress and to see how your culture is. If you can measure those actual things that you value as a company and as a culture. And the fifth thing was leadership behavior. And this is probably the most important input that you can have as a leader. Leadership or behavior is powerful. And behavior from leaders is the most powerful. So I would like to add something else to this list. I tried to see if it would fit in one of these categories, but I think it should be mentioned by itself. And I was listening to another presentation by a man named Chris White in a presentation called 3 Ways to Create a Work Culture That Brings Out the Best in Employees. He said, when we feel psychologically unsafe or unvalued, we protest quietly, sometimes even silently or subconsciously. Maybe we stop trying as hard at work, or maybe we act in ways that subtly undermine leadership or act against the organization's objectives. Recently, we studied a case study. It was in week 6 of our course, where we studied about a man named Ned Wicker, and he had put together this team, a work team, and they performed really well and they did good. But Ned kind of changed his values and changed his behavior without involving the team. And I think that they started to feel this way, that they felt unsafe and undervalued. And they started to protest silently, subconsciously, and even outwardly, and not doing their work, and some even quit. You know, have you ever felt this way in an organization? I would imagine that you have to some degree or another. So that suggestion that Chris White comes up with that I would like to add to the list is unblock communication. Continually invite people to speak up. And that's a great suggestion. Without communication, how can you improve a culture in an organization? People need to be able to speak up, and leaders should listen and respect. And they're going to come up with ideas that you will never come up with. So unblocking communication should be a continual process. All right. Achieving organizational culture is very important and should be a high priority for organizations that want to succeed and exceed expectations. Now, this presentation barely scratches the surface of a huge amount of information that's available for study on this topic. One thing that I learned that I wanted to share is that changing the culture of an organization never ends. It is a continual process that requires continual education, as illustrated in our chart that we showed earlier. It's a cycle that never ends. And if you don't pay continual attention to the culture, it will change, perhaps not for the better. Remember, culture is not static. Thank you very much. Appreciate your attention, and I enjoy this class very much.